Um, Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this second fireside chat this morning. As you saw in the previous session, His Excellency will begin with giving us a little tour of the horizon of what the African Union, the challenges the African Union has faced over the last couple of years, some of the challenges ahead for the African Union, and then we will get into a Q&A. Your Excellency will start his comments in English, and then the Q&A session, we may switch between English and French, so you can keep your headphones on during that time. Your Excellency, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. اسمحوا لي في البداية.
Allow me at the outset to thank the organizers of this conference for their invite to attend the Global Security Forum. Allow me as well to extend my gratitude to our brothers in Qatar for their good hospitality and the facilities that they have provided us with.
The theme of the fifth Global Security Forum, Reshaping the Global Order, Conflict, Crisis and Cooperation, is very relevant and timely. Indeed, our world is going through a phase of high risk, marked by war, for example, between Russia and Ukraine. In Africa, for more than 10 years, we have been fighting against terrorism in Libya, in the Sahel region, in the Lake Chad Basin against Boko Haram, the Horn of Africa, and recently in Mozambique, and there are some manifestations even in Eastern DRC. Our world is also marked by dire economic crisis as a consequence of war and the impact of COVID-19, climate change with its corollary of unprecedented food and energy crisis. Our world witnesses injustice and inequity. Africa is absent of international political and financial decision-making platforms. It is left out of the UN Security Council, in the World Bank and IMF decision-making organs. The step taken to admit African Union, as a member of G20 is a good step, but doesn't solve the problem because the institution and the rules are laid down by the powers that be of this world. Our world witnesses the refusal of the reform of the UN Security Council and the return to the era of Cold War. In brief, the world governance is at crossroads and has shown its limitations. Hence, the model has to be reshaped. I just want to recall that Africa is 1.4 billion inhabitants, 60% of which are youth, 30 million square kilometers, and abundance of natural resources. However, there is a tendency of transforming Africa into an arena for proxy war, which we refuse and reject. Africa has its own agenda, Agenda 2063, that is to realize the Africa we want, an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa. We have established the largest common market with the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA. But whose operationalization requires infrastructure, energy, new technology. We need investments. Africa is ready and open for partnerships. An illustration of this we have Africa-Arab World Partnership, Africa-Europe, Africa-United States of America, Africa-China, FOCAC, Africa-India, Japan, Turkey, Korea. There is no monopoly or any reserved area for any. Security is a priority for Africa. An important effort has been made in the fight against terrorism. AMISOM, nous ATMIS, for almost 15 years in Somalia. The G5 Sahel Force, the multinational joint task force in Lake Chad Basin, the SADC mission in Mozambique, and yet the UN Security Council refuses to finance through the assessed contribution of United Nations. In the case of Iraq and Syria, the world mobilized a coalition in terms of resources and troops, whereas for Africa it is not willing. Case of double standards. This phenomenon is worrying as it increases the burden on the member states, who have to devote huge budgets for military and defense. The case of Mali and others, the security being at stake, so the military pursue their action and resulting in a setback for democracy. You know, 4 coups happened in Africa. Yes. Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Sudan, 4 African countries are suspended from African Union activities. Ladies and gentlemen, we really need to reshape the global order. But how? To resolve conflicts. How do we tackle crisis? And how do we promote cooperation? Definitely not by leaving behind a quarter of the world population, which is Africa. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. I will pick up on a number of points that you made, but I will start by the crisis that much of the world has not given enough attention to. And this is a crisis in your own backyard, literally. The African Union is headquartered in Ethiopia, while the rest of the world has been consumed by the war in Ukraine. There was a war raging in Ethiopia for a couple of years, far more deadly war in terms of the damage done in people's lives, homes, livelihoods, creating a crisis of displaced persons and refugees. Eventually, after a great deal of effort, a ceasefire has been achieved with the help of the African Union. African Union is headquartered in Addis Ababa. You live in Addis Ababa. For the benefit of those who haven't been paying close attention, tell us a little bit about why it took so long to achieve the ceasefire. What are the prospects of the ceasefire going forward? And how do you resolve the political issues around the civil war between the central government and the Tigrayans in the north?
Thank you very much.
I will speak in French, says the chairperson. In November 2020, the war broke out in Tigray between the National Federal Army and the TPLF, which is the political and military organ which manages and governs the Tigray region. The war has been deadly. It has been very destructive. I don't have the exact result that I want to give you, but it was violent and has caused a lot of material and human damages. 2 years after, almost to the day, on 2 November 2022, with the contribution of the African Union through a panel which we established, led by President Obasanjo, we succeeded in bringing the parties to agree and signed an agreement in Pretoria in South Africa. This agreement is being implemented, maybe not at the pace that we would have wished, but I can assure you that the African Union has set up a team which is doing the monitoring in the region together with the two parties, and they have appointed liaison officers, and most of the heavy weapons have been returned to the National Army. Now we have the individual and the light weapons. And a number of activities, a number of services have been reinstated: banking, financial services, telephone. Schools are still closed because there is a lot still to be done in the area of health, as well as the infrastructure that have been destroyed. Another element of the agreement, because the conflict has involved Eritrea, and the fact on the ground is that an important number, or the majority of the Eritrean troops have withdrawn, have gone back to their territory, but we are being told that there are still a few other forces present. We have also the militia of the Amara, because there is a problem of border between the various regions in Ethiopia. They are still in the west of Tigray. The process is ongoing. What remains to be done is indeed to have transitional justice, the reopening of schools, and the political tackling of the problem, because there is a national political dialogue which is provided for in Ethiopia. African Union is trying with all its forces to bring the two parties to fully implement the agreement. The issue of justice is still there. The government has committed itself in the agreement, and after the agreement has been signed, to have accountability, and there is the will, at least, to move forward. First, we need to build peace and then deal with justice. It is a particularly murderous and deadly conflict, and in fact, this is what happened in a country that is hosting the headquarters of the African Union, although it has taken some time, but it's better late than never, and we hope that it will conclude so that the social fabric of the country can be mended. Thank you.
Opportunity for Africa, and particularly the African Union, to teach the West, to teach Europe something about conflict resolution. So often Africans have had to listen to lectures from Western leaders about how they ought to be conducting themselves, how they ought to be resolving their problems. What are the lessons from the African Union's dealing with the crisis in Ethiopia? What are the lessons, do you think, that can be learned, that might be applicable to the war in Ukraine?
The solutions of African problems should come from Africans, their own approach, their own culture, their own philosophy. One of the major surprises that I have witnessed in South Africa, when we brought the parties together, the Ethiopian parties, on the first day when we had the opening, we wanted to have a family photo, and the two parties refused to have a family photo. But curiously, when we resumed the negotiations the next day, the two parties asked us to leave the hall. The panel, the chairperson of the commission, the observers, because we have the United Nations, the United States, which are also observers. Everybody left the hall. For 2 or 3 days, the Ethiopians were speaking between themselves in their own language, in Amharic, because they even understand each other. And when we proposed the agreement to them, it went through smoothly. This gives us an idea of the nature that is those who are involved who know what it matters and what can be done and what should be done. Indeed, we need the assistance and cooperation of international institutions, the member states, like in the process in Ethiopia, we have the United States, which has helped. They transported the Tigrayans from Mekelle and to bring them up to South Africa. This is a support that we appreciate a lot. But it should leave the primary activity and action to be taken by the actors themselves.
Valuable lesson that is sometimes lost in the discussion over Ukraine, and a very interesting insight into how that process went down. Let me pick up on another point you made in your opening remarks, which is about the democratic retrenchment that has taken place in Africa over the last 2 or 3 years, and all over Africa, East Africa, West Africa, countries that had somewhat stable democracies, in some cases young and not so stable democracies, have receded, shall we say, and the governments have been replaced by authoritarian or military regimes. Why do you think this process has accelerated in the last couple of years? Is there a role that the rest of the world has to help, or is this another aspect that you think Africans themselves, or perhaps the African Union, should be left to resolve by themselves?
I believe that we at the African level and the African Union, we are also thinking aloud to try to take stock of 30 years of democracy and democratic process, because democratization with the type of Western democracy and elections, does this really correspond to the expectations of the peoples of Africa? The countries where there have been coup d'etat are, in fact, in a situation of insecurity. In Mali, the military took power thinking that and saying that the civilians could not really contain the threat of terrorists. In Burkina Faso, it's the same thing. In Guinea, it is a president who amended the constitution and wanted a third term, so there was a political crisis in the country, and the army took over power. In the Sudan, the African Union, after the fall of President al-Bashir, has intervened in the negotiations, and then in August 2019, an agreement was worked out, but was in fact breached in October 2022. But the question that arises, it is not obvious that a military regime can be the solution to the African problems. But when the economic situation, and particularly as regards security, worsens, then everything is possible, the doors are open. Now, to have a living democracy, there is need for support to ensure security, control the various threats. The threat of terrorism is a reality. That is why we are telling the United Nations, we are telling the UN Security Council that terrorism is a threat to peace and security. Is the UN Security Council in conformity with the Charter, which is in charge of international peace and security? So therefore, they have to revisit the UN missions and finance the AU-led missions. We Africans are saying that we are ready to mobilize the troops. You don't have to bring troops from Pakistan or from Europe or anywhere. Africans themselves can provide the troops. You just have to provide them with the necessary equipment, mandate under Chapter 7, and the financial means in order to effectively carry out. But we were not heeded, we were not listened. So therefore the situation, the security situation has deteriorated and has given a pretext to the military to take over power from the civilian. We are convinced that it is not the military that can solve the problem. We have to return to and restore constitutional order, but these countries have to be supported in order to emerge from this circle. I was in Bamako and in Ouagadougou. They tell me the threat is just 100 kilometers from the capital, and you want us to organize elections. How do we organize elections under such circumstances? There is a reality. Even in principle, the democratic principle has to be confirmed, but there is also another reality That is to take into account what is there on the ground if we want to have something serious and not only face value.
Restoration of constitutional order, whether it's elections or not, restoration of democratic processes. Are you confident that the African Union and other multilateral bodies within Africa have the clout, have the credibility with the principal actors, let's say in Mali or in Guinea or Burkina Faso, to impose that kind of order on the military regimes or authoritarian regimes that have taken over?
I think the term imposed is not the appropriate or correct term. We have to convince ourselves. First, it's a question of conviction. All Africans have accepted the principle of governance, the rule of law, the representation, and all have ratified our basic text, which is the Constitutive Act of the African Union. But we know that there are situations, and according to the countries, the degree of maturity of the political class, and also the socio-economic and security situations. These are factors to be taken into account. There is need to reaffirm the principles, then also the support that is to be given. We do it through our regional economic communities. For West Africa, we have ECOWAS, and the African Union is there to support. There have been economic and financial sanctions that have been imposed, but which have not produced the results. But we don't have to be dogmatic. We have to analyze the situation and do what, in fact, will strengthen the state, and then to restore constitutional order and to be serene and also sustained. Otherwise, we'll be in a vicious circle, and this is what is happening in Mali. There have been 2 coups d'etat. Burkina Faso, there have been coup d'etat, and this circle is going on.
You've been very eloquent here and elsewhere about the world's reluctance to support the African Union and African forces in general in the fight against terrorism. And there has been a tendency, certainly in Europe and in the United States, to think that the various African security forces are incapable of that fight. As you say, that's insulting to Africans to have to listen to that. And we've seen efforts from the West, from France most recently, to try and deal with the crisis in the Sahel with terrorism, and those efforts have failed. It doesn't get as much attention as, let's say, the American failure in Afghanistan, but lives are at risk, perhaps even more lives in the Sahel region than in a place like Afghanistan. What specifically do you need from the international community, from the United Nations, in terms of money, in terms of weapons, in terms of authority, in terms of freedom to operate? Specifically, what are some of the most important things at the top of your agenda that you need from the UN and other multilateral organizations?
When I came at the helm of the African Union Commission 6 years ago to the date, it was on 14 March 2017. 1 month after, we signed a framework agreement with the United Nations Secretary General on peace and security. They gave priority to the African Union to be in the forefront and then to be supported by the United Nations. 1 year after, we signed another framework agreement concerning economic issues. That is the relation between Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, and Agenda 2063 of the African Union. What the continent expects. The continent is facing terrorism. What is happening in Libya, what is happening in the Sahel, what is happening in the Chad Basin with Al-Shabaab in the Horn of Africa, the Islamic State in Mozambique. These are terrorist groups, as they are called. Since they call into question peace and security, they kill in a very violent manner the people, the civilians, and therefore we need international solidarity. The organ which is in charge is the UN Security Council. I recall that there are other missions, for example, in Mali, in South Sudan, in the DRC, which cost billions of dollars, but which does not have a mandate to carry out offensive action. They are going to maintain peace. There is no peace to maintain in this country. The fight against terrorism, we need to impose and enforce peace. That is why we have said that we need to finance the African-led missions. We have the troops, give us the arms, give us the mandate under Chapter 7, and then mobilize the necessary resources as you did elsewhere in the world. In 2012, they were at even the border of Algeria. Now they are in the Gulf of Guinea, in the Grand Bassam, in Côte d'Ivoire, in Abidjan. Now they are attacking Togo, they attack Benin. So they have gone beyond the Sahel. They have what you call the Gulf of Guinea, that is the entire West Africa is at risk. We, obviously for 5 years, we have been, in fact, making proposals, and the permanent members of the UN Security Council have been refusing and rejecting. They don't want to give the resources of the United Nations, which is unacceptable. In Africa, we are trying to mobilize, we have established what you call the Peace Fund. We have been able, with the contributions of member states, we've been able to mobilize $350 million. I mean, 350 million is peanuts when you consider these kind of missions that we have to undertake. So we need solidarity. Rwanda, for example, has sent forces to Mozambique to help Mozambique face the Islamic State. Chad and others, they have been sending forces to Mali so that they can work together. But they don't have the resources. We, first of all, want to address the United Nations, who has the primary responsibility for peace and security in the world, and also our partners to support this process, because the threat of terrorism is a reality. It is spreading across the continent, but nobody will be a winner if we don't do anything. So this is obviously fueling migration and pushing people to go out of the continent.
$50 million being a drop in the ocean. Do you have a figure in mind for how much you need?
Please.
Do you have a dollar number in mind for how much you need?
Je rappelle, par exemple,
I recall that in 2014 and 2015, when the G5 Sahel was established, the budget was $500 million in order to enable that force to carry out offensive actions in Mali. We did not receive that amount, while the UN mission in Mali costs at least $1 billion a year. People are living in camps, they are protecting themselves. They can't protect themselves because the enemy has other means of action and attacks. And obviously, Mali has been on its knees. Now they are in Burkina Faso, they are in Togo, they are elsewhere. And the estimates are there. We can sit down, if the principle is accepted, look at the dimension of the force that has to be put up, and then we also, very quickly, we can make the necessary estimates. It's the principle that has not yet been approved and accepted.
7. Could you explain a little more what exactly you need in that respect?
alors le chapitre 7,
Now, Chapter 7 is the one that authorizes the use of force, because when the force of an army of a country go into operation, they have to be protected. They have a mandate, the mandate of an offensive mandate. So they have to have the weapons in order to establish law and order. So the peacekeeping operations are not mandated to be offensive. So under Chapter 7, the force has to be offensive. That is, to attack and use the force in order to face the enemy militarily.
Professionally cynical. I have very little expectation from the United Nations Security Council. I would not have expectations even if there wasn't for a war in Europe right now. If I were to say to you, you're not going to get the help you need from the United Nations, where else can you turn? We're here in Qatar. Is there a role for the Arab states to play? Is there a role? Are there other countries outside of the United Nations framework that have shown an interest in assisting?
I am one of those, and I've said it openly and publicly to the African leaders, that first of all, it is our business, our work. We need to mobilize the African resources first and foremost. We cannot see a part of the continent which is under fire or blood spilling everywhere, and yet it does not correspond to our culture and our philosophy. So we have to start with the African states themselves to contribute, mobilize the necessary resources, and of course, when you count the number of African armies, there are millions of soldiers that are there. But naturally, our friends in the world, and for some, they have their own direct vested interests. Whether they have companies, they have firms, they need our resources and all. So they also should be able to contribute the resolution of this conflict, because when it starts somewhere, it spreads. Therefore, we need to nip it in the bud somewhere. So the military solution is not the panacea, is not all the solution, but we have a problem of governance, we have a problem of poverty, we have a problem to take care of the people. So the first and primary responsibility is that of Africans. We need to make our own efforts, but we need the support of their friends who are in the world so that it can be useful support and assistance, and I'm sure the Africans will be grateful to them.
I feel like I did in the previous section that we had just begun to we were just warming up, and there's so much more that we could have talked about. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of this session. I want to thank you for sharing your insights with this audience. Ladies and gentlemen, His Excellency,